or a flag. You throw a yellow flag. Dukes, how you doing, brother? Yes, sir. How's your ministry going?
Well, we're going 90 to nothing. I'm trying to get our bishops focused on the fact that we need to do something to criminal justice.
Okay.
We've been doing punishment as a solution to
Yes, sir.
Cancer patients.
Okay.
start on here.
Okay. Understand. Understand. Good to see you too, Dukes.
We had an article about the
Now,
caskets
do they tell us when to start?
sent to us the families, so that was successful.
Yeah, I love working with the monks. I'll talk about them
It's
briefly.
them. Okay. Does someone kick it off, or do I kick it off?
So were you working for John Locke? Who were you working for?
No, I got it World Magazine.
Oh, World Magazine, that's right.
Okay, so we just get it going. Okay. All right. Testing. All right, we're going to get started with the second panel. I'm a former school teacher, so I don't want to get too punitive here. On close the doors, get to your seats, get your pen and paper out, pay attention in class. But thank you so much for attending this Poverty to Prosperity Summit. My name is State Representative James White. I represent 5 counties in southeast Texas: Polk, Tyler, Jasper, Newton, and Hardin counties. I'm proud to represent those 170,000 Texans in southeast Texas, and I'm definitely honored to have this opportunity to engage with you and with our partners in TPPF. They do great work, and this is a very serious issue that has serious implications. Of course, the Lord that we serve is a Lord of abundance and prosperity. In our country, the United States, poverty is alien and hostile to our founding and our purpose. We are a country of abundance. We're a country of liberty. And obviously, poverty is not congruent with that agenda. So with that, on this second panel, hopefully we will get more practical. I'm a state legislator, so I'm looking for tools that I can walk across the street and implement for the people of Texas. I will briefly introduce the panel, and their bios are in your program here, so I will not do the oral assault and read to you what you can read there at your tables. But I want to introduce them and then allow them to get into their introductory remarks, and then from there we'll engage a little bit more deeply. One of our panelists, and I've read many of his works, and it's an honor to actually be in the same room with them, Marvin Olasky. He's the editor-in-chief of World News Group. My good friend from California, Chuck DeVore with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a very prodigious researcher and quantitative analyzer of many things. Jeff Rose with the Institute of Justice, doing the good work on economic liberty and justice and constitutional law. And of course, I will be your moderator during this discussion. So I will go ahead and start with legislative colleague Chuck DeVore, TPPF, to give us the predicate for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative White. I very much appreciate it. And by the way, I may have moved from California to Texas, but I'm a Texan now.
Okay.
So I just wanted to make sure.
I got you.
Just want to make sure that we clarify that.
Okay.
All right.
All
All right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, he lives in the district.
All right. So what I'd like to do today is to embark on a very quick crash course on poverty in America and how the federal government quantifies poverty, because if we don't know the definition of something, it makes it more difficult to attack the problem, right? So let's look into poverty in America. If you look at the 12 biggest states in America, from California at the top to Virginia at the bottom, the 12 most populous states, the official poverty rate developed by the U.S. Census Bureau ranks the states as follows, from the most impoverished to the least impoverished. Now, this is the official rate. It's been around for about 50 years, and it's important to understand it's based on a U.S. Department of Agriculture survey back in 1955 that looked at a subsistence diet, a bare-bones subsistence diet, and simply multiplied the cost of a subsistence diet by 3, and then kind of scaled it up or down depending on how many people were in a family. Then come along about 8, 9 years later, in 1963 and 1964, and think about what's happening in America about that time. You've got the Great Society kicking off. You have a couple more researchers now with Census Bureau taking that initial work from 1955 and developing it into the official poverty rate just at the time the Great Society was launching. And so these researchers' work then gets formalized in federal law and results in very specific programs going out to people based on how much money they're making. So that's the history of the poverty rate. Now, what's a challenge about that is two things have happened over the intervening 50 years. Kind of the old law of unintended consequences, and as we know, with government programs, once they start, they take on a life of their own. The challenge with the official poverty rate is, in fact, because it is based on 3 times a subsistence diet, what has happened to the cost of food relative to society's income over the last 50 years? Well, because of improved efficiency with our farmers, more free trade, better transportation, general increase in prosperity in the country, food as a portion of the average American's cost or income has gone from 13.5% to 10%. Actually hit a low of about 9.7%, but with corn ethanol and things like that, it actually pushed back up to 10% of Americans' income. So we're tripling a smaller share than we used to 50 years ago. That's number one. Number two, and this is a big one, the federal government considers the poverty rate, the level at which you earn income below which you're in poverty, to be the same even whether or not you live in Brooklyn or in Lubbock, Texas. Now, are the costs the same between New York City and Texas? No. Costs are about a little over 40% higher in New York State as a whole versus Texas as a whole. They're about 37% higher in California as a whole versus Texas. Everybody knows that when you travel across the country, but the United States government considers the poverty rate the same no matter where you live in the country. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a problem. So about 20 years ago, Congress instructed the Census Bureau to look into developing an alternative poverty rate, one, mind you, that isn't used for anything official, but it's now being published. So about 17 years later, they started to publish it. Now, I need to talk to my president and CEO, Brooke Rollins, about that sort of turnaround. The Brooke, you know, you've asked me to look into poverty. Let me get back to you in 17 years. Do you think I'd still have a job? I don't think I'd still have a job. So let's look at the top 12 ranking now. If we change it and we actually look at the supplemental poverty rate. Now, all of a sudden, California goes to having the highest poverty rate among the Big 12. In fact, they have the highest poverty rate in the nation under this alternative measure of looking at poverty that takes into account the variable cost of housing only. It doesn't look at the higher cost of food in California or clothing or medical care or education. It only looks at housing. It also looks at things like taxes because the poor pay payroll taxes. It looks at things like employment-related child care expenses. And it also includes, unlike the official poverty measure, non-cash assistance such as SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, aka food stamps. It looks at Section 8 housing vouchers. So it actually adds in and counts these non-cash benefits in its calculation. And we see that California's poverty rate actually is 7.4% higher than the official rate. Texas, on the other hand, is lower. It's 1.3% lower than the official rate. Now, what's interesting about this new way of looking at poverty that's more comprehensive is it still doesn't account for some of the underlying differences between the states. And so if you start to look more detailed, you start to look not only at the cost of living, but also demographic subtleties between the states, you'll see the measures begin to change. And you'll see Texas looking better and better and better as you begin to account for more information. For example, among the top 12 states, California and Texas are the only two states where you have majority-minority populations. In Texas, 42% of Texans are white non-Hispanics. In California, it's 39%. Both of these two states, that are the two largest states where 1/5 of Americans live, have the same exact percentage of Hispanics. So they're very alike demographically, these two big states, and yet, as you're going to see, very, very different results when it comes to poverty. So what we do is now we're going to look at the three largest racial, ethnic, or national origin groups in America. Those three largest groups are white non-Hispanics, black non-Hispanics, and Hispanics of specifically Mexican national origin. Now, the reason why it's important to consider very specifically what national origin the Hispanic population comes from is if you look into the details of the incidence of Hispanic poverty, what you see is vast differences depending on what national origin the Hispanics hail from. For example, Cuban Americans have the lowest rate of poverty among Hispanics, whereas people from the Dominican Republic and from Puerto Rico have the highest. And Mexican Americans are a little bit below that as a standard or as an average. And the reason why we need to compare like to like is that states such as New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania and Florida have very high percentages of people from Puerto Rico or Cuba or the Dominican Republic and not so many Mexican Americans. Whereas, of course, in California and Texas, Illinois, you have a lot of Mexican Americans and very few of the others. And so it's important, again, that we compare like to like. So let's do that. Now, all of a sudden, when you do that, you start to see something very interesting. Which state has the highest white non-Hispanic poverty rate when you take into account things like the cost of living? California. Isn't that shocking or not? And at the bottom, you see New Jersey. But just above that, there's Texas at number 4, the fourth lowest. Now, what about the African American population? Well, look at there at the bottom with the lowest poverty. You have Texas tied with North Carolina. How many of you all knew that as Texans? That among the 12 biggest states, one of the most significant minority groups in the country enjoys the lowest poverty rate among its big state peers. Might you think that perhaps policies might have something to do with that? We'll explore that in a little bit. And then if you look at among Mexican Americans, again, Texas ranks very well with among the lowest poverty rates among the 12 biggest states once you break things out. And so if you add some more context then, you see that, as we said, that Texas is tied with North Carolina for the lowest poverty rate among African Americans. We have the third lowest rate among Mexican Americans, and the lowest taxes among the 12 largest states. I'm thinking there may be a connection that Texas has the lowest taxes between the 12 biggest states and pretty decent poverty indices for its demographic groups. Now, not uncoincidentally, Texas also has the strongest job growth among the 12 biggest states, and perhaps Texas's low poverty rate, I'm just asking the question, just putting it out there for some intellectual curiosity, perhaps poverty and the rate of poverty has more to do with the availability of jobs, and perhaps it has less to do with the generosity of government programs, just maybe. Okay, so let's compare the two biggest states. I'd mentioned earlier that California and Texas are home to 20% of Americans, and they're very similar demographically, which means that comparing these two big states means more than, for example, comparing Texas to Vermont, right? I mean, Vermont, come on, we have ranches that are bigger than Vermont, right? So what can you learn about comparing Texas to Vermont? Let's compare Texas to a big state peer, California. And so the most recent data from the Tax Foundation said that in 2011, California collected as a share of state income in state and local taxes 52% more in taxes than did Texas. Let me tell you how bad it was. I used to be the vice chairman of the Revenue and Taxation Committee in California, a very thankless task. I'm so glad I'm not doing that anymore. Talk about voting no all the time and losing all the time. But if you outlawed, if you got rid of California's income tax with the highest tax bracket in the country, 13.3% of income, if you just got rid of that source of income, California would still tax more than does Texas. If you got rid of California's sales tax, they would still tax more than does Texas. Only if you got rid of the property tax would their taxes be lower. And I'm talking about one or the other, not both, right? Not income tax and sales tax. So that's how much they tax. 45% greater state and local spending as a share of the private economy than Texas, but proportionately 47% more people in poverty as a share of the population, meaning for about every 3 people in poverty in California, you have about 2 in Texas. On the other side of the ledger, Texas has 63% higher job growth and creation than did California since the end of the recession. And when you take into account the cost of living, according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Texans enjoy a 7% higher real per capita personal income. And by real per capita personal income, we're talking about the money and how far it goes. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis is looking at things like the cost of housing and the cost of food and the cost of clothing. And so even with Silicon Valley, even with Hollywood, even with all that abundance on the Pacific coast, Californians come behind Texans when it comes to how they actually live with the money they earn. And that's before taxes, ladies and gentlemen. That's before taxes. And so I would suggest that as we look at the issue of poverty, we must first frame the data and understand how the cost of living influences the rates of poverty across America, and with that understanding, then illuminating our understanding of poverty, suggests perhaps changes to laws, regulations, public policy, and welfare policies to improve the well-being of Americans everywhere. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chuck. I'm Jeff Rose. I'm a senior attorney with the Institute for Justice. We're based in Arlington, Virginia, but we have an office just across the street here in Texas, and I divide my time between both of those offices. Although my family and I live here in Texas and are proud to have moved back here a year ago. When we actually go out to her family ranch, which is in West Texas and is almost as big as Vermont. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do at IJ. I'm a constitutional lawyer. And one of the pillars of the Institute for Justice is economic liberty. And that is ensuring that people have their constitutional right to earn an honest living free of unreasonable government interference. And so I want to talk a little bit, and this is one of the most important labor or economic issues in the country. It's actually a relatively small number of people who are in unions. It's a relatively small number of people who are paid the minimum wage. 30% of people in this country now need permission from the government before they can work. They need an occupational license of some kind. And so this presents a puzzle. How do occupational licenses work? One of the things we've done at IJ since our inception in the early 1990s was to look at African hair braiding. And not because African hair braiding is just like everything else, but because the problems that African hair braiders face are symptomatic of a basic dysfunction throughout the economy and our system of regulation. So think about African hair braiding. For those who don't know anything about it, it is just using your hands to twist and braid hair. You don't dye it, you don't have to wash it. You don't have to cut it. You don't use any fancy instruments. And it is a tradition that has been passed down, usually from mother to daughter or from aunt to niece, for centuries. And it was actually brought over from Africa. So here's the thing. This is a perfect occupation for a low-income person to go into. They can start their own business, and yet over the past 2 decades, one of the things we discovered is that if a woman wants to start a small African hair braiding business or wants to work as a braider in someone's salon, the government cracks down on them. The government says, you need a cosmetology license. You need to spend thousands of hours and thousands of dollars becoming a full-fledged cosmetologist in order to braid hair. And you know what? The curriculum at the cosmetology school doesn't teach anything about braiding. And so that's a puzzle. Why is our government stopping people from earning an honest living, from extricating themselves from poverty? And this burden falls particularly on people who don't have the sort of resources to just, go to law school or do whatever's necessary like I did to become a lawyer. So that's weird. And so I want to talk about this in the context of the courts. I'm not going to talk about it in terms of necessarily in terms of government policy or what you can do. I want you to think about this in a new way, from the perspective of judges. What is the proper role of judges? Everybody hates activism. Everybody's always talking about activism. And I want to tell you that activism is a good thing, or at least judicial engagement is a good thing. Striking down unconstitutional laws, enforcing principled constitutional limits on government power is a good thing. And what we have now is not so much activism as a problem. What we have is judicial abdication. Striking down unconstitutional laws is essentially anathema to judicial culture, and that's something that we have created. And it's something that the Institute for Justice is working to undo, not just through our strategic constitutional litigation, by winning cases and changing the case law, but by talking to people about what constitutes real judicial engagement, taking the whole of our Constitution seriously. The world you see around you is the world created by the U.S. Supreme Court, and here in Texas by the Texas Supreme Court. Created indirectly, but created by those institutions. And what does that mean? So in the absence of principled constitutional limitations on government, what you have is the dynamic described by public choice economics. And public choice theory is politics without romance. It's politics stripped of idealism, and it's politics that is subject to empirical observation. And what that means is that in the real world, interests with the time, expertise, money, and incentives bend the legislative process to their will. And that the laws we have and the world we have are the laws and world created by, to a large extent, highly motivated interests. And so I'll ask you a question, which nobody has to answer, but what is the per ton price of producing steel in South Korea? Nobody knows. You shouldn't know. What is the per ton price of producing steel in Pennsylvania? You don't know either. You're rationally apathetic. What fraction of your refrigerator or your car or the rebar used to build the bridge on I-35 is the result of the difference between those two prices? You don't know. Nobody knows. But you know who knows? The executives of Pennsylvania steel companies, their lawyers, and their lobbyists know. And voila, we have tariffs on South Korean steel. That's where it comes from. If you want to know why things are expensive, it's because of that. So I know a lot of people are involved in the legislative process, and so I'm not going to exhort you to be more noble, because the problem isn't with particular legislators or their personal venality or their greed or their inability to resist. It is in the nature of the legislative process that we have. It is the incentive structure of the legislative process. And one of the important disincentives of antisocial, anti-economic, pro-poverty legislation is that the Supreme Courts, both our state Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court, are not enforcing limits on legislative prerogatives. And so interests are able to accomplish what interests routinely accomplish. And I'm not going to blame business either, frankly, because they respond rationally to incentives. They're out there to make money, and one way to make money is by persuading people to buy your product making a better price and a better product at a cheaper price and persuading them to buy it. Another way to make money is getting someone to pass a law that clobbers your competition and drives up prices for consumers. And businesses in the United States do both things. So we have to change the incentive structure of the we have to rely on the non-political institutions to change the incentive structure, and that institution is the judiciary. So why is it like that? Well, let me tell you a little story about some clients I had. And these are the monks of St. Joseph Abbey. And the monks of St. Joseph Abbey live in a monastery, and they have lived in this monastery. It's just across Lake Pontchartrain, north of North Carolina. And when Hurricane Katrina blew through in 2005, they lost an important source of income for the monastery, which is this forest that they would periodically harvest. And the monks it's a Benedictine order, and St. Benedict enjoined the monks of his order 1,600 years ago to earn money through the labor of your own hands. The monastery doesn't get money from the Catholic Church. They are a family, and they have to put bread on their own table the same way everybody else does. So when Hurricane Katrina destroyed an important source of their income, they thought to them, someone came along and said, you guys have been hand making these caskets for yourselves for almost a century, and they're quite beautiful. And they sort of express the noble simplicity of the monastic life. So they thought, this is a great idea. We're gonna set up our little casket making business. We'll make 50 or 60 a month, and we'll be able to pay for the health care of our elderly monks. We'll be able to pay for the education of our young monks. Well, the local diocesan newspaper ran a story about them on All Souls Day, November 1st, 2007, before they had even sold a casket, and said, hey, the monks have just started this little business. Before they had sold one casket, they were investigated by and got a cease and desist order from the state of Louisiana, who informed them it is a crime to sell a wooden box without the permission of the government, and you don't have it because you are not a licensed funeral director. That investigation was the result of a complaint. Was it a member of the public who complained? Do you think anybody out there is worried about buying a casket from a monk? The person who complained was the person who runs the biggest funeral home chain in the state of Louisiana, who is a past president of the state regulatory board, and who is a past president of the state lobbying group. So if you want to understand why the monks weren't able to go into business, it has nothing to do with the government working in the interests of the public. It has to do with private interests using government power to siphon money out of the public treasury and out of our wallets. And one of the constitutional principles we are determined to establish at the Institute for Justice is that the use of government power for purely private economic gain is illegitimate, and courts should be enforcing that. That isn't judicial activism, that is judicial engagement. And if the courts do that, they alter the incentive structure of the political system. It no longer becomes profitable for lawyers and lobbyists and business people to spend all of their time lobbying the government. It is no longer sensible for politicians to devote their time to doing that. And we have a more economically rational government. We have a more economically rational society. And that starts with the judiciary. And just in case you're not, I think there probably is a number of people who have a conservative or libertarian background like me. You may be interested to discover that when you're if you're talking about judicial activism, what's essentially going on is the conservatives have completely co-opted and integrated the liberal progressive era perspective on the courts. That what happened in the 1930s is that the court said, we're getting out of the business of judging economic laws. All the government has to do is come into court and make up a reason. It can be an imaginary reason. That happened in the Monks case. We won the Monks case, but it was a very close call. The government came in and said, hey, maybe the people of Louisiana are too fat.
No,
Yeah.
I'm okay.
Okay, maybe the people of Louisiana are too fat. So they need to have specially licensed funeral directors to wedge their enormous frames into these oversized caskets. They're just making stuff up. Yet the courts have said it's okay for the government to make stuff up. In fact, a distinguished federal judge, who I won't name, said the reason why the courts took this perspective was to save government lawyers and the government the embarrassment of coming into court and actually saying in open court what really goes on in legislatures. And he's right, because it's embarrassing. So, the important thing that people on the legislative side can do is understand that economic liberty is essential. The free market is the greatest poverty reduction program that has ever been devised, and yet our government ceaselessly bleeds its vitality. And one of the important ways that we ensure economic liberty is by populating the courts with judges who understand that they have a cardinal responsibility to enforce the whole of the Constitution, including our right to earn an honest living, and that when someone challenges irrational government regulation as a violation of their economic liberty, courts should strike that down. That's not activism, that's judicial engagement, and that's what courts should be doing, and that's what we're doing at IJ. So with that, I shall sit down. Thank you.
Very much.
Well, Jeff, I would buy a casket from a monk. In fact, it just reminds me of a story of three old men who are talking about what they'd like people to say after when they've just died and people are filing by their open casket, and one says, I'd like people to say he was a good man. And the second says, yeah, I'd like people to say he was a kind man. And the third says, well, I'd like people to say, look, he's moving. Anyway, so there are a lot of programs that are good. There are a lot of programs that are kind. The question before us today really is what programs help to move people from poverty to prosperity. I'd like to talk about a couple of things. First, what has been helping people under the radar over the past decade. And then second, what we can learn from the failures of the past 20 years and the success of apps and websites like Airbnb. So first, my own experience over the past decade comes out of awards that my magazine World gives each year, the Hope Awards for Effective Compassion. We give 9 small charities about $45,000 in prize money when they've shown that they offer challenging personal and spiritual help. That's the kind we find that works. And these programs, these ministries usually start with one person thinking about how he can use his talents and experiences to help others. And we organize it, we have some fun, we organize like the NCAA basketball tournament. So we end up with a Final Four from different regions, and then people vote online on this. I'll tell you briefly about the South Region winners this year and last year. This year's winner is Murray United Ministries of Murray County, Tennessee. It's an hour's drive south of Nashville. It focuses on one simple but crucial endeavor, giving rides to people without transportation, and in the process, building relationships. Its founder and executive director, Randy Nichols, has done it now for 17 years. He's a retired mechanical engineer. He did it part-time for 7 years, and he retired. Now he's doing it full-time for the last 10. He coordinates right now about 5,000 trips a year, connecting 25 volunteers with folks who don't have cars, but they need rides to get to work or job training or a doctor's office or a GED class or a daycare. And the goal, Nichols says, is, quote, to show the love of Christ while providing for transportation needs. Now, this Murray United Ministries grew out of Nichols' Bible reading and his self-appraisal. He said, I'm not a great speaker, I'm not charismatic, so I looked for something I could do. I started praying, and he thought about transportation needs, and then he recruited volunteer drivers, say, can you help a day a month? And he got drivers from lots of different churches, and my wife and I went around with some of the drivers. We asked why they do it, and they gave the answer that is the correct answer for every question in Sunday school, Jesus. So that's this year's winner. Last year's South Region winner, Beltline Bike Shop in Atlanta. Beltline had its informal start in 2008. Couple Tim and Becky O'Mara moved to a South Atlanta neighborhood, poor neighborhood. They wanted to be good neighbors. They had no particular plans to start a ministry or things like that. One day they were walking their dog in the park across the street from their house, and there's a little girl named Brittany. She owned a bike. They knew her, they'd seen her, but she told them, well, I'm not riding it because it has a flat, worn-out tire. They offered to help fix the bike if Brittany would do some chores around the house to pay for the new tire and needed new tubes and some other stuff, as it turned out. So she did that. She helped a little bit for a couple of weeks. The O'Maras came through on their promise. Brittany was thrilled. The O'Maras enjoyed her excitement. They began putting out word to folks in their churches, if you have bicycles that your kids have outgrown, we'll take them. And as bikes came in, the O'Maras invited kids to earn the bikes if they're willing to do odd jobs, particularly picking up trash in the park. And once the kids owned the bikes, they would come to the O'Maras for help with flat tires and loose change. And before long, before long on Saturday morning, the O'Maras' driveway looked like an old parts junk shop. 20 to 30 kids repairing their bikes, learning about repairing their bikes, telling other kids about it, and so forth. And these ripples kept expanding. Soon the O'Maras set it up. Before the kids could earn a bike, the O'Maras tried to meet their parents or their grandparents, usually single moms and so forth. The park was cleaner. More kids were outside riding bikes rather than just kind of huddling inside. The bikes became a way for neighbors to connect. By last year, kids had earned 257 bikes, They had repaired 2,744. They had picked up 830 bags of trash, and the kids were also getting this developing work ethic. During spring break, the O'Maras noticed that a lot of 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds were looking for jobs. They were going around saying, can I work? Can I walk your dog? Can I clean your house? Can I dig a ditch? And Tim O'Mara says, well, it's a natural result of earning bikes and seeing that work pays off. So that's last year. And I should mention, since Sandy's sitting back here, Work Faith Connection, one of the programs I love, was our winner, our regional winner 2 years ago, and then voted by people our national winner. And Work Faith Connection is more than a mom and pop thing, as many of us are. That's about as big as we can get. Most of our winners are smaller than Work Faith Connection. It's a great program. If you're in Houston, please get involved in it. I've seen these small but effective programs all over the country. And you might think, okay, we're talking about from poverty to prosperity. How will a ministry that gives rides or one that teaches kids to fix bikes, how does that help people go from poverty to prosperity? Well, it's starting things. And one little group by itself isn't much, but you multiply that by 1,000 or 1,000,000, and you have enormous positive social change. I've written a couple of books on the history of providing effective compassion in the U.S., and I can tell you that from colonial days through the 1920s, Americans saw a problem and in quiet, humble ways did something about it. It was these little groups, these little platoons, these things that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about in the 1830s that really changed America and helped millions of people come out of poverty, including my grandparents who came here 100 years ago. Now we pay our taxes or we donate money to have professionals take care of the problems. They can't do it because we've found over the centuries that compassion to be effective needs to be challenging and personal and spiritual. It's hard for impersonal government programs to challenge people, you all know that. And constitutionally, we don't want government getting mixed up in religious matters, so what do? Let's start by thinking about what people like the O'Maras or Randy Nichols need, and what people in other cities who could be like the O'Maras or Randy Nichols need. These are potential social entrepreneurs. They need time. They need some running room. If they have to take a second job to keep up with taxes or payments for their children to go to decent schools, they won't have time to help. If moms need to enter the workforce when they'd rather be at home part-time and helping their neighbors part-time, they won't be able to volunteer their time. Fewer social entrepreneurial programs get off the ground when we think the professionals, whether they're government professionals or foundation professionals, when we think they will handle the problem. They're not going to be able to do it. The key to American poverty-fighting success from the 1620s up to the 1920s is that we did not have this division of amateur and professional. I'll read you a note from the minutes of one New England Town Council meeting in 1673. Quote, Syrian Squire and Sam Morehouse agreed to take care of Roger Knapp's family in the time of their great weakness, end quote. That was the typical action of governments back then. They would try in this local area to enlist a couple of families to show mercy toward a third. What can they do? What can we do to help these social entrepreneurs get started, to help families, help other families? This was the person-to-person help that worked in America for 3 centuries. So I worked out, when I was writing history books on the subject, I worked out an ABCDEFG set of principles that guided our successful war on poverty from the 1620s up to the 1920s. In the interest of time, I won't go through all 7. I'll go through the first 2, affiliation and bonding. You find out what affiliations needy individuals have in the community, and you help to restitch them, whether they're family affiliations or church affiliations or organizational union affiliations, whatever. You try to look at people not as wandering atoms, but as people in community. And if there aren't any connections, you try to create a bond between the person who needs help and the person able to give help. So that was the successful experience. And again, you can read about it in these books I've written. How is that relevant to our problems today? Because I suspect you're thinking, well, gee, those who can help and those who need help, they often live far away from each other. They don't know what each other's really doing. A lot of people in the abstract want to help, but they don't know how to. They don't want to get in over their heads. They're willing to stretch their comfort zone, but not bust it. So how do we connect these individuals who don't know each other? And here's where we can learn from the success of these websites and apps like Airbnb and others. Before Airbnb, hospitality was in the hands of professionals and amateurs. There were hotel personnel for most travelers. If the traveler happened to have a friend in the town he was visiting or a relative, maybe he'd stay in their house. Airbnb breaks down the professional-amateur divide. And instead of staying at the nearby Marriott or Motel 6, there are over 11 million persons who have booked spare rooms that strangers have in apartments since 2008. But only after the strangers were not so strange, because you could find out something about them online and you could read what others had to say about them. The same breakdown of the professional-amateur divide is starting in transportation. Uber is in a big fight now with the Austin City Council, Sidecar, et cetera. Errand running, there's this thing called TaskRabbit. Education, this is starting to happen, Skillshare and others. What about helping people escape poverty by giving them both material help and guidance, sometimes organizational, sometimes spiritual, in how to live successfully? In the late 19th century, volunteers in big cities set up charity organizing societies to match needs and giving capacity. But it was hard. It was hard to share information. People had to physically transport records. It was a difficult process. Today, with online opportunities, it could work. It has worked after disasters like Katrina, and after more recently Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey. Victims were able to find free or cheap housing online. Now, I'll be glad to discuss with anyone here the principles that I've derived from the historical research. I am not competent at all to plan out how the charitable equivalent of Airbnb would work. I do think someone will figure that out, and in the process revolutionize how we provide housing and other help to the poor. I'll close with this. And again, I am incompetent technologically. I know something about history. I'll be glad to get together with anyone who's interested in this. But let me close with this. This is some wisdom from C.S. Lewis, who said that when we strive for heaven, we get earth thrown in. When we strive for earth, we get nothing. I've seen for 25 years, and Bob Woodson's seen this for much more. I learned a lot from Bob, just about everything really from Bob, about poverty fighting. And he's absolutely right about asking the people who do it and the people who are emerging in the communities here. But I've seen for 25 years that people who come out of poverty do so because they've gained a long-term perspective. People who don't usually fail because they keep thinking day to day or maybe hour to hour. And there's a theological connection here. For people who believe in God, everything matters. For those who don't, really nothing matters long-term. If we tell people they're just the product of time plus chance, so nothing is truly significant, we should not be surprised when they just try to eke out some momentary pleasure day by day. So from past poverty fighting successes, we can learn both the principles and the theology that underlay those principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just go ahead and take the liberty and get our engagement process started here. You know, when I traveled throughout my district, I just noticed, I'm just astonished at the talents that my constituents have. Baking cakes, doing crafts, sewing and quilting. And earlier this summer, I challenged a group of pastors to challenge their congregations, their parishioners, to at least start a home-based business. And every member in their church do that over the course of the year and put these talents, these immense talents, into some type of marketable fashion. So I brought that up to ask my colleagues here on the platform, as a legislator, what would be your priority for the next session as far as a policy to tackle poverty in the state of Texas and have a state where everyone can achieve their hopes, aspirations, and dreams?
If you're asking as the former lawmaker from the state that gives the examples of what not to do, I should think that there are a few very big things that the session ought to be looking at. First and foremost, I think that the legislature ought to be looking at school choice for all children in Texas. We completed and released today the results of a statewide opinion poll, over 800 Texans asked, and by 87%, Texans believe that school choice for all children can be one of the effective tools used to reduce poverty. And as we know, there's a lot of connection between poverty and education. Clearly, we ought not to consign people by the zip code that they can afford to live in to attending substandard government schools. And school choice is a way of transcending that. Another big thing is we have a very inefficient tax in Texas. It's a tax on hard work and entrepreneurship. It's called the margin tax. We have enough of a surplus that we could get rid of it. We could repeal the margin tax. And in so doing, spur job growth and economic vitality. And some of our research into the incidence of poverty across the nation indicates that one of the best anti-poverty measures is a vital and robust economy with a growing labor force, more so than government programs to hand out assistance. And so I should think that those two things taken together would be a very powerful tonic in Texas, one more short-term, one more long-term as far as school choice. If you got those two things done, I think I'd be a very happy member of the think tank community myself. So,
Thank you. Yes, Jeff?
Sure. So I think a legislative priority is passing economic liberty legislation. And this would have a couple of effects. One, if the government tells somebody that they can't do something or that they need an occupational license for doing something, and the person takes the government to court, the burden is on the government to prove that the regulation is necessary with actual evidence that someone will be harmed if this person goes ahead and does their job. And so, you know, there's no question that if somebody wanted to open a heart surgery shop without any training and then decided to sue the government, it wouldn't be difficult to marshal real evidence that completely incompetent people shouldn't be performing heart surgery. But on the other hand, if someone says, you know what, I want to offer haircuts in my neighborhood. You know, I want to offer $10 haircuts or $6 haircuts out of my house. And the government says, no, you can't do that. You have to go to school for 2 years to give somebody a haircut. That actually the government has to come up with real evidence. And if the government can't do that, then the person should be allowed to do that job. And I think this, another element of it would be essentially like some element of consent. Namely that if someone wants to open a shop, either it's a home-based business serving food or doing haircuts or some other kind of thing, and as long as everybody understands that that person may not have the same certification as someone who's gone to cosmetology school for 2 or 3 years, they should be able to do it. I mean, the fact is that we're all grown adults, and if I want to get my hair cut from somebody who has a pair of scissors and doesn't have 3 years of training, but I think that person knows how to do it, I should be able to do that because I'm a grown adult. But right now you can't. The people just aren't allowed to consent to do things. I think it's actually crazy. And so the law should reflect that. And then the third point of the economic liberty legislation would specifically be about home-based businesses. Okay. You know, America has a tradition of people starting amazing businesses in their garages. You know, the Whole Foods, for example, was started in John Mackey's garage. Right now, if he wanted to do that, he basically couldn't. There's so many zoning restrictions and so many occupational licensing restrictions that if you're an entrepreneur with a great idea who wanted to do something out of your home, it's actually would be really hard. And the kind of thing you're describing about people making cakes and quilts and doing other things out of their homes, it's actually really hard to do that in many places, and you can get in serious trouble for doing it. So anyway, but if any of your constituents try to start a home-based business and the government tells them they can't, I'm actually looking for a case, the kind of case we could do. So
All right.
Let them know, and I would like to do a strategic constitutional case vindicating the right to run a home-based business.
Right. I like your entrepreneurial spirit there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with what all three of my fellow panelists have said, but let me just do a couple of riffs on them. I mean, first, the economic liberty legislation, home-based businesses, absolutely, and this is part of breaking down the division between professional and amateur that I was speaking of. That's happening all over our society, and it has to happen here as well. So that's crucial. School choice, what Chuck said, I mean, this is huge, and it's huge in poverty fighting for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, the most obvious one is kids get a better education, and they're not going to be condemned to bad schools. But also, when parents can send their children to the school they want to send their kids to and be confident that the kids are getting good education there, that enormously frees up the parents if they can do it in a way that's economically viable for their family. So a lot of parents now take second jobs, or a lot of moms work who would rather not be doing that, and they do that to pay tuition for Christian schools, other private schools, and so forth, because they have confidence in those schools and they don't have confidence in their local public schools. That not only that effort is very commendable and even saintly, but it takes that person out of the volunteer market, essentially. That person cannot do, just because there's no time, to do the charitable things that otherwise would be doing. Either the person has to be out working to earn the money to pay that tuition, or has to be involved in some other way that take them from that volunteer effort. And that's what we need to do. We need to free up time in people to be able to do these volunteer efforts that have been successful over the centuries. Now, if in order to get this through the legislature, a little sweetener is needed, and Representative Wright, you're much better able than me to see whether this would be a good idea or not. But you could even do something that, for example, if there are going to be school vouchers or something else to allow for school choice, well, the parent in return has to do something, maybe volunteer some hours at a charity. So there's a trade-off. So that takes away the argument, well, we're just giving money to people from others who they could earn another. Well, no, they're doing something to get that money, to get that tuition, and that would be a trade-off that would help all the teams involved.
Okay. Thank you very much. And yes, we have a hand here. I believe there's a nice lady that will come to you with a microphone, and we'll get to you as well. Yes, sir.
Mr. Rose mentioned the need for legislators who, judges who put the Constitution ahead of what I think some judges call deferring to the legislature. My question is, how do you do that? I mean, obviously, you try to elect people to office who understand that when they approve judge appointments, that this should be considered. But, when you have a lot of people in this country who believe in the Constitution as a living document, et cetera, we got a problem there. How do we deal with that?
So it's a good question, and it, the highest appellate judges in the country, the U.S. Supreme Court and the Texas Supreme Court, are at least initially appointed. I think the Texas Supreme Court, they're subject to recall elections periodically, but what that means is that our choices about who become judges are very important. And fundamentally, what we have to do is change the culture, change our understanding of judges. And that is not a small thing. We started the Center for Judicial Engagement at IJ to address this perception that judges are dangerous to democracy. And of course, one of the problems is that when legislatures make a recommendation, or let's say when the Senate makes a recommendation to the president about who should be a federal judge, one of the things the Senate is thinking about is this going to be the kind of person who's going to strike down the laws that we create? And there is an amazing left-right consensus in this country among politicians that we don't like judges who strike things down for the most part. The people on the left don't like judges who strike down economic regulations, and the people on the right don't like judges who strike down social regulations. And so one of the things we have now is a federal judiciary that is populated by judges who are very reluctant to strike down laws. And really, this is a long-term, fundamental cultural change. It took a long time to build up. There was a big cultural change on the left in the 1930s. And then on the conservative side, as a reaction to the Supreme Court's decisions essentially on reproductive rights, and then to some degree on other social issues, conservatives became determined to have judges who had what's called a minimalist philosophy. Because conservatives were determined to have abortion laws, for example, and other kinds of social legislation that so-called liberal judges wouldn't strike down. So now you have this perfect consensus on the right and the left that the kind of judges we like are the judges who will just defer to and rubber stamp legislatures. And that's a long-term cultural thing that we're trying to change, and it's one of the things I like to talk about, that the problem isn't judicial activism anymore, the problem is judicial abdication, and that what we need are judges who are in the middle, who take their role seriously, who look at evidence seriously, and eliminating judicial tests or constitutional standards in which the government wins just by making stuff up, which is what we have now when it comes to most social and economic legislation. The government can just invent imaginary justifications and that is sufficient under Supreme Court precedent.
Thank you. This nice lady at this front table, and then we'll come back to a hand that was in the middle, and we'll get back to you in the rear as well, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Two quick comments. I want to go back to school choice. I would like to see the polling on parental choice. Using the word parental choice makes it a little bit sweeter. I'd like to see, I know there's been polling before on that, and school choice is a great, is great, but I'd like to see how people react to parental choice rather than that. And then instead of vouchers, calling them opportunity scholarships. I think that is vital, and that would be absolutely amazing. And you said make it a little sweeter across the board. And I think opportunity scholarships is key to calling, instead of calling them vouchers. That's my comment.
I believe we were here in the middle, right here. Yes, ma'am.
A question that maybe none of us are fit to quite answer, but when we look at, and I'm just going to pick on Chuck as Illinois and California being two perfect examples of how to be screw-ups, we know this. You can empirically prove it. An imbecile can read it. Why can't we ever get, I'm just going to pick on media or somebody. It is so obvious. 2 + 2 = 4 every single time. Why can we never seem to get this presented to those who are not with us? And I don't have the answer. This really is one of those questions. How do we get the idiots on the other side to wake up?
Well, perhaps I think you were in the room, but maybe this is just a softball question. But if you listen to Robert Woodson's presentation in panel 1, he had some very sound recommendations as to how you go about getting the word out, which is to focus on those individuals who have experienced poverty themselves, who for whatever variety of reasons have been able to raise children, who have become productive members of society, stayed out of prison, got good jobs, developed businesses, run volunteer organizations, and equip these individuals with the ability to go out and spread the message and talk to opinion leaders, elected officials, business people, et cetera. And as I recall, what Dr. Woodson said, focus on the 30% that are doing it right, rather than necessarily the 70% where we constantly have the problems. Now, I think that is key. Certainly, exercises like this are important as well because we're speaking to a different audience. But when you're trying to spread to the vast masses, I think that that's pretty sound advice.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Rose. You mentioned bringing a lawsuit against the government for overreaching legislation to have the judiciary look at it. I'd like to get your thoughts on this doctrine of sovereign immunity that's taken hold. In Texas, the state can violate your rights secured in the Texas Bill of Rights, admit that it did so, admit to the property loss caused, and say, but you can't sue us. We're above the law. So what is your thoughts on that and its relation to to free enterprise, this loss of the rule of law?
So that's a pretty esoteric question about the extent of sovereign immunity doctrine. I mean, it's an ancient doctrine that says the king is immune in his own courts. So I'll say two quick things. One, we actually have a case that is currently being decided by the Texas Supreme Court that bears on the question of the extent of judicial recognition of sovereign immunity. And so it is one of the issues that came up in the context of licensure. And we're generally in favor of doctrines that constrain legislative and executive power in a systematic and rational way under constitutional principles. Now, the second thing to say about sovereign immunity is that it probably isn't a massive legislative priority, but legislatures can waive sovereign immunity. And so in many instances where government is growing irrationally, one thing a legislature could do is create a backstop for people by by creating a law that says we're going to waive sovereign immunity in all of these different contexts. But that's a very that's a complicated question, and I don't have a simple answer other than to say that judges ought to interpret sovereign immunity as narrowly as possible, frankly.
Can she get this lady back here, and then she'll come back this way?
Hi, my name is Vanessa Sadia. I'm the executive director of CAN, and we study issues like suburbanization of poverty in our community. Just one thing I want to say, this is just a comment, and then I watched a video by Richard Reeves of the Urban Institute last week, and he talks about upward mobility. I mean, the reality is, if you're working at a minimum wage job, you're working at McDonald's, you're making $15,000 a year, that means you're out of poverty, because poverty for one person is $10,000 a year. So really changing this conversation from getting out of poverty to upward mobility is really important here, because it's not enough, in Austin especially, for a family to make ends meet. You need 200% or more of the federal poverty level. So that's just one thing that I have shifted my thinking on, is upward mobility. And when we look at the pathway to opportunity related to upward mobility, it also has to do with the expense side of the family. How much they're spending on transportation, can they get transportation, health insurance, childcare, all those things that burden that side of the family. Because we're talking a lot about revenue, and that's important, but I think we also have to pay attention to the expense side. And then one more thing is, I am deeply concerned when we look at Central Texas. We keep a dashboard of community statistics. 1 in 10 low-income students in Central Texas who are going into higher ed are actually completing any kind of degree. And when I ask those kids, why are you dropping out? It's affordability. Sometimes they don't feel like it's relevant. It's all those other supports. I see Austin Community College in the room, and I appreciate that. But it's also about, it's not just about income. It's like all those other supports that families need to move them up that opportunity path. And so.
Thank you. Chuck, you wanted to comment on that?
I think that a partial answer to some of the concerns that you raised was mentioned by Alan Graham in the past panel, and I think maybe Robert Woodson touched on it as well. And it has to do with some of the federal rules that are in place regarding our programs to help the poor, and how the states administer those programs under federal rules. I believe that 18 years after the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, we've seen a lot of retrenchment in America, where a lot of the rules that were put in place with that very important landmark legislation 18 years ago have actually been incrementally rolled back, and I think we've lost some ground. I believe it's time for welfare reform 2.0 at both the federal and the state level, and the one thing that I think is very vital to focus on is that many free market conservatives will often talk about the marginal effective tax rate and how if you tax more of something, you get less of it. Well, if you look at welfare benefits or other benefits to the poor, Section 8 housing, food stamps, if you look at what we do to poor people as they begin to earn extra dollars, the highest marginal effective tax rates in America are not on folks like Warren Buffett with his unearned income. It's on the poor, where you actually have rates as high as 85%. In other words, you earn an extra dollar, and you're going to have 85 cents taken away from you in government benefits. Talk about a powerful disincentive to work, to lifting yourself up and getting ahead. We need to reevaluate that, because the incentives apply across the spectrum of income, whether you're wealthy or whether you're poor. People are people. And if you bust your hump and only get to keep 15 cents of that extra dollar you earn, you're likely going to just say, you know, why should I try?
Okay, this young man here at the front table, please.
My question is just an extension of this gentleman's question earlier about the role of courts. So it's for Jeff. Critics of judicial, those who criticize a greater role for the courts, those who advocate for judicial minimalism, argue that there is a risk that courts will write new rights into the Constitution, that only enumerated rights should be protected by the courts, and there's a risk that unenumerated rights might receive some sort of protection. Can you elaborate on that point?
Sure. This isn't a plant, but Arif is my colleague, so I don't want to, full disclosure here. First I should explain the distinction between enumerated and unenumerated rights. An enumerated right is a right that is expressly written in the Constitution, such as the First Amendment. That is number one. Number two is the right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment. But there are also rights that we have in our constitutional tradition that have always been understood that are not formally enumerated. They are embedded in our Constitution and our constitutional traditions in a variety of ways, one of which is the right to earn an honest living. That doesn't exist on the face of the Constitution, but it is there in our constitutional traditions, and certainly the right to earn an honest living has been an indivisible part of the American experience since its inception. So I think the distinction is that courts are bound to recognize rights that have a genuine basis in our history and traditions, and to understand that what the Constitution creates is a space for people to make decisions for themselves, and that the Constitution has an appreciable meaning. Its words matter, its original public understanding matters, and that constrains the freedom of judges to just invent rights altogether. Now, at the same time, I want to say that the risk of a bad judicial decision, and bad judicial decisions can be overturned by subsequent courts, the risks of bad judicial decisions are relatively low, whereas the risks of judicial abdication cumulatively are enormous. So I think that is a legitimate concern, but it is a concern that is excessive in light of our actual experience, and the fact is judges are not recklessly creating new rights.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, any other hands over here? Okay, if we could, yes, Representative Toth.
James, just going back to the question earlier about, it got into the cost of education, why kids are dropping out. Every time we give and create more opportunity to lend money, mysteriously, the cost of education goes up too. So what kind of strings can the state legislature put on these institutions, these public institutions that we also give money to in the back end, to make sure that every time we give more money to folks to go to school, they don't just raise their tuition rates?
Well, I think you're certainly hitting at something that's part of the iron law of economics, right? If you give endless truckloads of money to institutions of higher learning, you're going to see tuition rates rise far higher than the consumer price index. I think that what you have in Texas is an interesting pushback against that that's beginning to be seen more throughout the country, is the concept of the $10,000 degree. You're also beginning to see business more and more beginning to understand that not every college degree is treated equally, and furthermore that there are certain certificates or courses that can be completed not in college that are perhaps more valuable in many business contexts. And I think you're beginning to see a reevaluation of higher education in America, where both prospective students and parents are beginning to question the wisdom of a four-year degree in all circumstances, especially if it's in some of the liberal arts rather than in the sciences or STEM, the STEM area. But I think that the $10,000 degree with public institutions in Texas is a great antidote to that, creating a relevant, affordable program and encouraging students to complete it in 4 or less years.
I think we have opportunity for one more. Since you're closer there, we'll go ahead and take the mic there.
I really like y'all's thoughts about legislation that we could do in Texas, but I really think that if you want to help with upward mobility, which I don't know where she went, but that was amazing. That's a great phrase. I think it's talking about payday lending loans. I think it's talking about SNAP benefits, and I think it's talking about affordable housing. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. I think school choice is great, margin tax, I know people disagree on that, but I think we need to focus on actual issues that affect the people we were talking about in the first panel. But Mr. Rose, I was wondering if you could expand on, or maybe just talk about the kind of constitutional challenges that we've had when states try to reform SNAP benefits or unemployment insurance. and some of the limitations that we put on those benefits and how those affect people that are trying to gain that upward mobility.
Right. So I don't actually, I'm afraid I just don't know enough about that area of the law to have an informed opinion on it. But I do know, and to echo Chuck's statement earlier, that there is a genuine poverty trap. And that is something that absolutely has to be reformed. And the other thing too is that, I'll just say that with respect to education, I think most education is kind of a waste of time in this country. Like, I've kind of come to figure that out as I get older, and my kids are getting, I have like a 4-year-old and a 19-month-old, and I look around and, why we're making everybody, for example, master high-level math, or why we're making them read Shakespeare, something that for a lot of people it's just puzzling and makes them seem dumb and is alienating. Like, why don't we have what do you call them, like apprenticeships? You don't need to go to school to become a plumber or a cosmetologist. You could just start doing it and just learn how to do it from people who know how to do it. And we've decided that social prestige depends on getting a degree from college. And so we have this arms race with all of these colleges and everybody being forced to go and everybody spending enormous amounts of money on degrees that are just a waste of time. So, it strikes me that a fundamental social change that we ought to do is just revamp our approach to education and the prestige we assign college degrees and the amount of money we pay for them and that kind of thing. I think that'd be good.
Just one thing about SNAP benefits. We've covered this a lot in World Magazine, and we've just seen so many instances of government officials in various parts of the country really pushing very hard to get more people onto SNAP. That should not be the goal. It should be there when people need it, but it should not be something that government is promoting and congratulating each other on when they get more millions of people signed up. That's not its purpose, and in fact, it hurts the program for the people who really need it. You're putting more water in the soup, and the people who actually need better nutrition aren't getting it.
Thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a strong round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our side, the right side, is really the compassionate side on this issue of poverty and prosperity. And I have one announcement here. Lunch with Reverend Robert Sirico will begin at 12:30 p.m. Please make your way to the SFA bar for coffee as we flip the room for lunch. Thank you very much.
All right. Good job. Thank you. You gonna stick around, or you gonna?
Yes.
We found out that Houston, Texas, Harvard education doesn't do any good. Look at our quarterback. He just throws interceptions. He'd been better than Trinity.